All right, I'm Nicole John-Cizian, news editor for All Israel News, and I'm here today with Seth Frantzman. Did I say that right?
Yes, 100%.
Okay, good. All right. And I know of Seth's writing in the Jerusalem Post, but you're also the author of Drone Wars. And I follow your analysis of the region, and I also happened to see your documentary of Ukraine from 2017. So that was very prescient, actually. But I was really intrigued by some of your recent analysis of what's happening in the region, because we've got, if you look at the Israeli news, the top stories are about Ukraine. And it's, not like we don't have anything going on in Israel, but there had been a big focus on the war there. And yet I heard somebody say we need to start getting our focus back on Iran, because things are going on while eyes of the world are elsewhere. So I'd just like to hear your comments on that.
Well, yeah, thank you for asking me. I think that obviously the conflict in Ukraine is very important, and they're talking about 4 or 5 million or more refugees. But I think in the Middle East, definitely Iran is certainly waiting to see what's going to happen next. And I think that there's 2 or 3 avenues of approach that they may be, let's say, preparing to go down. One is the whole Iran deal issue. I think they want to see if there's going to be a deal. And obviously they're holding back from further attacks or provocations to get the deal. It looks like the messaging from Washington is there may not be a deal, in which case I think that Iran will want to ramp up its attacks. And I think that we've already seen that being unveiled, because Iran has been using increasingly cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones to attack countries in the region. Sometimes it does it directly, like in 2019 in September when it attacked Saudi Arabia. Sometimes it gives the drones or the rockets to its proxies, like Hezbollah or the Shia militias in Iraq or the Houthis in Yemen, and then it gets them to attack someone. Like the Houthis attacked, I think, the UAE in January and February. We've seen Iran attack Erbil in the northern Kurdish region of Iraq. We saw just yesterday 2 attacks in which Iran attacked U.S. forces in Syria and attacked Erbil using, maybe some local militia or something, but this is Iran. So I think it's clear that there is a march to conflict. Iran is always pushing the envelope. It wants to see how far it can go, how many people it can kill or wound or what have you before there's a pushback. And I think the evidence is that Iran has a lot of impunity in the region, and not a lot of countries want to have another conflict with Iran. That being said, they're willing to put defenses in places, to shoot down drones, maybe to carry out an airstrike here or there, but that's the extent of it.
Okay. Also, there was last week, or is it already 2 weeks ago, the Negev Summit. And we had hosted here in Israel, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Egypt, actually. And one of the things that you wrote about that is that Iran is going to test the relationship, these new relations, and that really caught my attention. So, how might Iran test this alliance?
Well, the amazing thing about the Negev Summit, that was an unprecedented meeting in which foreign ministers from 4 Arab countries, I think, came to Israel, and the United States Secretary of State. So I don't think ever in Israel's history did you see so many important people in one place in Israel. That's a big message to Iran that all of these countries, are very happy to openly sit down with Israel. It's not some sort of secret meeting or something where you read about a leak about it. It's very open. Iran has been always working to prevent that, and Iran has always threatened countries that are willing to normalize with Israel and say, well, if you normalize with Israel, something bad might happen, because Iran is a bit like a mafia state. It doesn't behave like a normal country, and it does often threaten other countries with this kind of mafia-like talking point of, well, it would be a shame if something happened to you. So I think that we definitely see Iran increasingly threatening those countries that are doing business with Israel, and that's especially the Gulf. So we've seen the attacks from Yemen targeting the UAE. We've certainly seen Iran up the rhetoric against Bahrain. Bahrain is a very small country. It's a country that's very close to Saudi Arabia, defense in terms of defense. Iran can make a lot of troubles for small countries in the Gulf. It's already done that, but it can do more. It's mined ships in 2019. It's used drones to attack ships last year. It has even kidnapped whole crews of ships and stolen them. So Iran is willing to do almost whatever it wants in the Gulf of Oman, and that can terrorize shipping. And as we all see with the Ukraine crisis, there's a big spotlight on international trade, because there's a lot of inflation in the West. Nobody wants a conflict over the big oil routes. And I think that now with the political crisis in Israel, it only increases the chances that Iran might like to say, okay, let's test this again. So I think that's the big concern.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And speaking of the political crisis in Israel from just this week, what is Iran likely to do while Israel is now, or what are we looking at in the next couple weeks as Israel, well, we don't know if it's gonna be days or weeks as Israel sorts out its political drama of what's going to happen. How will Iran use that situation?
Well, we have to wait and see, but I think there's a chance Iran could try to create a crisis. Now, question is, Iran has to say to itself, does it benefit from a crisis? If there's a war right now, if Iran attacks Israel with missiles, let's say using Hezbollah or Hamas, or groups in Syria, let's say, and there's a conflict like there was last year in May, a conflict, that came out of Ramadan, so it's a tense time anyway. Does Iran think that it benefits by that crisis? There is a chance that if there were a crisis in Israel, of course, there will be a tendency to want to keep someone in charge and rally around a prime minister. So does Iran come out of that, winning, or does it strengthen Israel's hand? I think that Iran will want to question that, but I think that also it always wants to test Israel's defenses. So that could mean more drone attacks. It could mean targeting strategic infrastructure. It could mean, as I've written before, targeting Israel's friends in the Gulf. So, or targeting U.S. forces in Syria, as we saw last night. So I think there's entirely a chance that Iran does not like the fact that the U.S. and Israel coordinate in terms of the Syrian issue, because Israel has, openly bombed many times Iranian positions in Syria, and the U.S. supports that campaign. And I think there is a clear messaging from Iran. They would like the U.S. out of Syria, and then they feel that will strengthen their hand there to entrench, to bring missiles and weapons and drones and all sorts of things. So I think that's where we want to look to see, where would Iran like to be? Because Iran thinks the Israelis are distracted. If Israel's distracted, I think nature abhors a vacuum, and Iran always wants to rush in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I appreciate your insights, and I will definitely be tracking, see what what's going on. But thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.